She spent years cleaning homes that were never hers, polishing silver she'd never eat from, and smiling through words that cut deeper than anyone knew. Then one day an invitation arrived, an invitation that wasn't meant for respect but for ridicule. The wealthy man who sent it thought it would be funny, a cruel little joke shared among his kind. But what he didn't know was that she had already decided this would be the day she stopped being invisible. When she walked through those mansion doors, every eye turned and every whisper died. What happened next left the entire room speechless. Before that night, Marjorie lived a quiet, ordinary life, one built on early mornings, long bus rides, and the smell of cleaning supplies that clung to her hands no matter how hard she scrubbed. She worked for families who never learned her last name, people who left their dishes piled high, their shoes scattered, their voices echoing through marble halls that weren't meant for her. But she didn't complain. Every paycheck meant food on the table, rent paid on time, and a little hope tucked away for her daughter's future. That hope was what kept her going. Through the exhaustion, through the whispers, through the way some looked right past her as if she didn't exist. At the mansion on Crestwood Hill, she worked for Mr. Whitmore, a man whose wealth was matched only by his arrogance. He'd made his fortune in real estate and his reputation in cruelty. To him, people like Marjorie weren't employees. They were background noise. Still, she showed up every day, her uniform pressed, her smile gentle. She believed that dignity wasn't given. It was kept. Then, one Friday afternoon, as she was polishing the silverware for yet another of his lavish parties, she overheard something. Laughter. Sharp. Mocking, and her name tangled in the middle of it. That was the moment everything changed. She didn't know it yet, but that cruel laughter was the spark that would ignite the most unforgettable night of her life. The laughter she overheard that afternoon lingered long after the guests had gone. She couldn't stop replaying the words in her mind. "We should invite her to the gala," one of the men had said. Imagine her face walking into that place. She'd probably think she belonged. The table erupted in cruel amusement. And then the voice she knew best, Mr. Whitmore's, added, "Fine, let's do it. Send her an invite. Maybe she'll even shine the floors while she's there." Marjorie froze behind the kitchen door, her hands trembling. They weren't inviting her out of kindness. It was mockery, dressed as generosity. That night she sat on the edge of her bed, the invitation resting in her lap like a dare. The words were elegant, gold-embossed. "You are cordially invited to the Whitmore Foundation Gala." She could still hear their laughter behind every syllable. Most people would have thrown it away. Most would have spared themselves the humiliation. But Marjorie wasn't most people. Something inside her stirred, a quiet fire that had been smothered for years under obedience and silence. She looked around her small apartment. The faded curtains, the cracked photo frame of her daughter in a graduation gown. Everything she'd endured had brought her here. Maybe it was time to stop being invisible. Over the next few days, she worked her regular shifts, polishing, scrubbing, mopping, but her mind was elsewhere. Every corner of that mansion she cleaned reminded her of the people who'd laughed at her. Every insult she'd swallowed became fuel. She didn't have wealth, she didn't have status, but she had pride and dignity, and that would be her power. She spent her evenings at a thrift boutique downtown, finding pieces she could rework. An elegant dress, a necklace with a missing clasp, a pair of shoes she polished until they gleamed. Bit by bit she built her armor, not to impress them, but to remind herself who she truly was. When the night of the gala arrived, the city was draped in gold and glass. The Whitmore mansion glowed like a palace, lined with luxury cars and laughter that spilled onto the marble steps. Inside, guests in designer gowns floated from one conversation to the next, champagne in hand, unaware of what was coming. Marjorie arrived alone. She didn't have a driver or jewels or an entourage, but when she stepped out of the cab, the air shifted, heads turned. Not because she looked out of place, but because she carried herself like she didn't belong beneath anyone. The same guards who'd barely nodded at her before now hesitated, unsure of what to say. Inside, conversation stilled for a moment as she walked in. The music seemed to dim, every whisper, every stare. It was the attention they'd never imagined she could command. And then across the room she saw him, Mr. Whitmore. His smirk faltered. The joke wasn't funny anymore. What Marjorie didn't know was that this night, this single defiant entrance, was about to turn into something far bigger than a party. Because before the evening was over, every person in that mansion would see her differently. And for the first time in her life, she would see herself the way she was always meant to. The ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, every surface gleaming with wealth. Laughter rippled through the air like fine perfume. And then, silence. Marjorie stood at the entrance, the same woman they once ignored, now radiant in a deep gold gown that caught the light with every step. Conversations faltered, eyes widened. The same people who laughed behind her back were now frozen in disbelief. She moved with grace, her head held high. The same dignity she carried through every long shift now turned into quiet power. But just as she reached for a glass of champagne from a passing tray, a voice sliced through the music. "Well," Mr. Whitmore drawled, his smirk returning. "You really did show up." The room chuckled, hesitant, uncertain, but cruel all the same. Marjorie didn't flinch. She simply turned toward him, her expression calm. "Of course," she said softly. "You invited me." He raised an eyebrow. "And tell me, who dressed you?" "Macy's clearance?" Laughter came louder this time. Sharp, ugly sound that filled the hall. Someone whispered, "She actually thinks she belongs here." Marjorie felt her heart hammering in her chest, but her voice never shook. She looked around at the faces, smiling, sneering, waiting for her to crumble. "No," she began. "I've spent years making this place shine. I know every crack in these walls, every stain you tried to hide. I've cleaned up after your parties, after your mistakes. And I've watched the way you treat people like me as if we're nothing." The room went still. "Tonight," she continued, lifting her chin, "came to remind you, your money doesn't make you better. It just makes the dirt harder to see." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Whitmore's smirk disappeared. Cameras turned, whispers spread. In that moment, under the blinding light of his own mansion, it wasn't the millionaire who held the room's power anymore. It was her. For a long moment, one moved. Laughter, the arrogance, the cruelty, all dissolved into silence. Mr. Whitmore stood there, stripped of his smirk, staring at the woman he once mocked. Around him, guests looked away, unsure what to do. Their champagne suddenly tasted bitter. Marjorie didn't need applause, didn't need revenge. Her truth had already done what years of silence never could. She placed her glass on the nearest table, turned and walked out through the same door she once entered as a servant, now leaving as something far greater. Outside, the night air was cool and still. First time in years she breathed deeply, freely. She didn't win a prize or a promotion or fame. She'd reclaimed something far more valuable, worth. Word of what happened spread fast. Tried to spin the story, to make it sound like a misunderstanding. But those who were there that night knew better. They witnessed what dignity looks like when it refuses to bow to prejudice. Marjorie went back to her life, still working, still providing, but with her head held higher than ever. Came a quiet legend among those who'd been overlooked. Reminder that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply stands tall and refuses to shrink. Because in a world that still measures people by color, class, and status, Marjorie's story asks us a question we can't ignore. How many more times will we laugh at those we should be learning from? How many more voices will we silence before we finally start to listen? This wasn't just her story. It's ours.